Chapter 7. Last one's in a polecat, shouted Willie. He kicked off his boots. He pulled his shirt over his head without bothering with the buttons. Charlie and Mac were undressing as fast as they could, too. They were all down at the old swimming hole in the creek. It was a hot summer afternoon. The cool stream looked very inviting. It took Charlie only a minute to get his Indian clothes off. With a splash and a shout, he jumped into the water. "Hurry up, slowpokes," he yelled. Willie started to yank off his trousers. One of his feet got caught, and he tumbled over. Mac threw his clothes down and jumped in with Charlie. "Guess that makes me a skunk," Willie said. "Watch out, you don't get too near me." Finally, he was ready. Instead of jumping right in, he ran up to a high bank a little distance upstream. It was a long drop to the water. "I'll make up for being last," thought Willie. "I'll just show them a dive." Before he could stop to think how far it was, he dived into the water. "Man, look at that Willie dive," said Mac. "Let's get him in a race," said Charlie. The three boys splashed in the water. They raced and dived. After a bit, they all climbed out and sat down on the bank to catch their breath. "Phew," sighed Willie. "You fellows wore me out with all those races." Just then they heard a loud whinnying and stamping of horses' hooves. The noise came from the little grove where the boys had tied their horses. The three boys jumped up and started for the trees. They heard shouts and laughter. "Look," said Mac. "That's the Cranor boy and a couple of his friends." "Who's that with the fancy riding pants?" Willie asked. "He comes from way east somewhere, I heard," said Mac. "Man, is he stuck up." "They oughtn't to be frightened of our horses," said Willie. It was 3 years now since Comanche had been stolen. Willie didn't want anything more to happen to him. Cranor and his friends rode out and dismounted. Cranor was a big husky lad, much bigger than any of the others. "Hey, what's the idea?" Willie shouted. "Who wants to know?" said Cranor. He didn't act very friendly. "Why, we do," said Willie. He measured Cranor's size and wouldn't like to fight him, thought Willie, but he was angry. He went over to Comanche and spoke to him. "Calm down, old fellow," he said. Charlie quieted his horse, too. "You oughtn't to go around spooking horses that-a-way," said Willie. "One of 'em might get hurt." "What kind of English is that word, spooking?" said the boy from the east. "Back in Boston, where I come from, my friends know how to speak correctly." Willie and Charlie couldn't help laughing. "Seems as though you came a long way looking for trouble," Willie said. "Richard's spending the summer at our place," said Cranor. Willie scratched his head. "Well now, Mr. Tenderfoot from Boston, I reckon you never spooked a herd of cattle. Spooking or frightening, it's all the same if you start a stampede. It's bad." "Naturally, we don't have stampedes in Boston," said Richard. "We leave that sort of thing to ruffians like you. Why, you all look like wild Indians." Charlie McClellan didn't like that. "Sure, Willie and I are part Cherokee," he said. "Who do you think you are, anyway?" "Well," said Richard, "my family is one of the oldest in America. My ancestors came over on the Mayflower." Willie remembered what Sally had once said, and he grinned. "I reckon you don't know how much about old families after all," he said. "Why, if your folks came over on the Mayflower, our folks were already here to meet the boat." Richard opened his mouth to say something, but he couldn't think of anything to say. Charlie and Mac laughed. Even Cranor smiled a bit, but he and his friends turned toward the swimming hole. "Whoever you are, you shouldn't treat horses that way," called Charlie. But they didn't pay much attention. "I suppose there's room enough for all of us to swim," said Willie. But they had better leave the horses alone. Willie and his friends began swimming about again. Willie dived off the high bank once more, and then Charlie tried it too. Mac ran up and looked down the steep bank. It looked pretty high, so he just held his breath and jumped in. Kerplunk! Water flew everywhere. It splashed all over Cranor and his friends on the bank. "Hey, watch what you're doing!" Cranor picked up a handful of mud and threw it at Mac. Mac ran into shallow water. He grabbed a handful of mud and threw it at the three on the high bank. The mud splattered all over them. They yelled, and all three started throwing mud at Mac. Willie ran to help him. "Lend a hand, Charlie," he shouted. They grabbed handfuls of mud and started to pelt Cranor and his friends. All 6 boys shouted and threw mud as hard as they could. Cranor caught Willie in the back of the head with one gooey lump. "You 3 get on out of here and we'll stop," he yelled. "We got here first," Charlie shouted back. He threw a big wad of mud. It hit Richard full in the face, and the boy yelled as he rubbed the mud out of his eyes. Willie stopped a minute. He patted the back of his head where he'd been hit. This is getting serious, he thought. Somebody's going to get hurt. Just then he ducked a flying chunk of mud. I don't see why they had to come and spoil our fun, he reflected. There's the cool creek flowing quietly along, and here are all 6 of us fighting instead of swimming. Mac let out a yell. That one had a rock in it. Well, 2 can play at that game. There's plenty of rocks here for us. Willie decided it was time to do something. Now looky here just a minute, Mac, he said, and he walked over out into the middle of the battlefield. He yelled, and you fellas up there too. Stop talking and fight, yelled Cranor. Now you listen to me a minute, said Willie. Then if you want to, I'll fight you myself. You know I can lick you, and Charlie and Mac know it too. Charlie and Mac nodded vigorously. Willie looked at Cranor. My, he was big. I hope he doesn't call my bluff, he thought. I'll just talk him out of it. You know, I wouldn't want to have to lick you just because of a little mud. Why, this is all kind of silly. Look at all of us, all covered with this gooey stuff. Look at this nice water, just waiting for us to enjoy it. Why, I reckon there's room for all of us and then some. Willie went on talking, and all the boys listened, and at first they were angry, and they muttered, and they waved handfuls of mud, but as Willie talked on in his good-natured way, they began to feel foolish. Willie was right. What was the use of fighting? Why not be friends and enjoy the swimming hole? How about it? Let's take a swim, Willie was saying. Remember, I can lick any of you if there's any trouble, but let's have some fun. Last one in is a polecat. This time, Willie was in first. I'm with you, said Cranor. I want to get this mud off me. And soon all 6 boys were swimming around, having a good time together. Charlie McClelland swam over to Willie. How'd you ever do it, he asked. Do you really think you could have licked Cranor? Well, now, I guess Cranor isn't such a bad guy after all. Anyway, I made him think I could lick him, said Willie. He hesitated. Still, I'm kind of glad I did. I didn't have to try, though. All through the hot, dry summer, Willie and Charlie and Mac swam and fished and rode their horses. Willie looked after his herd. He kept training Comanche to be a good cow pony. He practiced his roping on anything that moved, and he roped Dan Walker's goats and his calves. He chased wild turkeys, and whenever he got a chance, he helped the cowboy with their ranch work. He never stopped. He never told himself, I'm going to be the best hand in the territory. He just told himself, I'm going to be the best hand in the territory. One afternoon, Willie and Charlie rode back from the swimming hole, and they went past the bunkhouse. What's that on the ground, said Willie, and he jumped down and he picked up 2 fat black cigars. Well, what do you know? I guess one of the hands must have dropped these. Wonder what it would be like to smoke one. They don't look very good to me, Charlie said. Maybe I ought to learn to smoke, said Willie. Looks as if a real top cowhand ought to smoke cigars. I don't suppose I really ought to, he thought. Papa says I'm too young, and I guess all the cowboys don't smoke, but golly, I wonder what it's like. Let's see one of them, said Charlie, and he turned it over and over and he smelled it. Doesn't smell so bad, does it? Maybe we'd better put them in the bunkhouse, though. Willie examined the cigar closely. You know, he said, I'll bet you're going to have to learn to smoke a peace pipe. Isn't that right? You want to learn all the Indian ways, don't you? Well, maybe sometime, Charlie said, but looks like I ought to help you learn, said Willie. What do you say we just take a puff on these cigars? Charlie looked doubtful, but he was curious too. Well, maybe. Willie bit off the end of a cigar, and so did Charlie. The tobacco didn't taste so good as it smelled. It was strong and bit their tongues. Mighty fine, aren't they, said Willie. My, that tastes awful, he thought. Oh, yes, said Charlie. Then he hesitated, and he looked at his cigar. Do you think we really ought to? Oh, sure, said Willie. Let's light it up. They lighted their cigars, and they rode slowly out over the prairie. Willie puffed hard, and the smoke nearly choked him. It burned his throat and his nose, and his eyes smarted. He coughed, and he looked at Charlie. Charlie puffed away too, and the smoke nearly choked him, but he didn't say anything. You know, said Willie, I don't suppose a fellow would have to smoke these things to be a real cowboy. If he smoked too much, he'd probably never amount to anything. And Charlie didn't say a word. He just held his cigar, and he looked at it. Willie took another puff. What's the matter with my stomach, he asked himself. It's turning over. Oh, he felt dizzy. He swayed at the saddle. Charlie, he said weakly, we made a big mistake. He dropped his cigar, and he rode over to a tree and slid off in the shade. Charlie joined him. Willie, he said, the ground won't hold still. Willie wanted to laugh, but he felt too sick. Charlie was right. The ground seemed to be turning upside down. How could I have wanted to smoke a cigar, he thought. That's what I get for being so doggone curious. The boys lay in the shade for half an hour. Finally, they began to feel a little better, and Willie sat up. Suddenly, he smelled something. Smoke! He looked up. Oh my gosh, we've set the prairie on fire. Charlie jumped up, and for a moment the boys could only stare at the glowing, smoking brush. It was right where they had dropped their cigars. A gust of wind blew across the prairie, and all of a sudden the dry, smoking weeds burst into flames. The fire roared, and billows of smoke poured up. The boys forgot about being sick. They rushed over and they tried to beat out the fire with their coats, but they couldn't stop it. It was spreading fast. The wind was blowing it toward the ranch buildings and the haystack. "Quick, Charlie, let's get water," Willie shouted. He was frightened. He and Charlie rode swiftly to the barn, and they filled buckets at the pump and carried them back to the fire. Still, they couldn't put it out. "Where are all the hands?" asked Charlie. "They're all off on a cattle drive," Willie answered, "all but Dan Walker," and he stopped to catch his breath. "Hurry down and get him, will you, Charlie?" Charlie dashed away, and Willie hitched one of the farm horses to a wagon, and then he filled buckets as fast as he could, and he drove the wagon toward the onrushing fire. The horse began to balk. Willie jumped down. He took hold of the bridle and led the horse close, and he talked to the horse, urging him on. When he got closer, he pulled the buckets out of the wagon and emptied them on the fire. Sparks flew all around him. They burned holes in his clothes. Great clouds of smoke blinded him. The wind was getting stronger, driving the fire faster, and Willie went back for more water. Charlie and Dan galloped up as he was going to the pump. "Look here now, boys," shouted Dan. "We've got to stop this. I'll get some barrels. The three of us can handle them." He ran into the barn, and soon the wagon was loaded with barrels of water. Willie and Charlie and Dan made trip after trip to the fire. At last it looked as though they had quenched the roaring flames. They stood and watched. The path of the fire was still smoking. Clouds of steam were rising from the water they had poured on the leaping flames. "Thank goodness it's out," said Willie. He hated to think what might have happened. The ranch buildings might have gone up in smoke, all because of his cigar. "I'll never try that again," he resolved, and they heard a cry. Maud was standing on the upstairs porch of the house. "Over there," she called, and she pointed. "Still burning." Willie, Charlie, and Dan ran over to one side. Sure enough, there was a new path of flame, shouting off in another direction. They hadn't seen it because of the smoke. "I'll get it," Willie yelled, and he dashed for the pump. He filled a bucket, and he climbed onto Comanche with it, and they galloped toward the fire. Suddenly, Comanche stumbled, and Willie felt himself sailing through the air. He hit the ground hard, and his arm bent under him, and he felt a sharp pain. For a minute, he couldn't move, and then he started to get up, and he found he couldn't raise his arm. It hurt so badly he had to sit down on the ground. "Darned old arm must be broken," he thought. "How am I ever going to put out the fire?" And Dan and Charlie galloped up. "Go on, I'm all right," he managed to say. Dan and Charlie went on and put out the last bit of fire. Comanche trotted back. Willie could see that he was all right. "You must have stepped in a gopher hole," said Willie. "Guess there was so much smoke we didn't see it." He managed to get up, and he took Comanche's bridle and started to walk back to the house. He began to feel faint and dizzy, and he stumbled, and that was the last he remembered. Willie opened his eyes. He should have been leading Comanche to the house. Instead, here he was in his own bed. He looked at his arm. It was covered with a heavy bandage, and it ached and throbbed. Maud came into the room. "At last you're awake. How do you feel?" All right, I guess," said Willie, "but look at my arm. How did I get here?" "Dan and Charlie brought you in, and Dr. Lane set your broken arm last night." Willie blinked. He could hardly believe it. He started to get out of bed. "Whoa there," said Maud. "You stay right where you are till tomorrow. You had a good shaking up." "Oh, shucks, Maud. I've got to go out and rope some calves today," said Willie. Then he looked at his arm. This was terrible. How could he rope and ride with an arm like that? Why, it would be ages before he could use it. He looked up at Maud, and she understood too. "Too bad, Willie, but it won't last forever. Only a few weeks. You'll be good as new." But I'll have to go back to school then. How will I ever get to be top cowhand this way?" Then Willie remembered about the cigars. It seemed so long ago. If only he hadn't tried that cigar, he wouldn't be lying here in bed with a broken arm. "Oh my goodness," thought Willie. "I wonder if Papa's right. I wonder if I'll ever amount to anything. I nearly burned down the ranch, and I broke my arm." "Maud," he asked, did Charlie tell you how the fire was started?" "Yes, he did, Willie." Maud tried to look very stern. "Oh, I wonder what Papa will say." Willie felt very sad, and he looked very sad. "Cheer up, Willie," said Maud with a smile. "I'm not really angry. You look so sad I just couldn't scold you, and Papa won't be angry either. He'll know you learned your lesson." Willie felt a little better, but He couldn't help worrying about his roping and riding. Why, he'd missed so much practice, maybe he'd forget everything he knew. Maybe his arm would be stiff, and he couldn't ever throw a rope again. The more he thought about it, the more miserable he felt. Maud was just trying to cheer him up. Well, somehow, he'd have to make the best of it. But what if he couldn't be a real cowboy? Maud, he cocked his head to one side and looked up at her out of the corner of his eyes. Did you ever smoke a cigar? Did I? Oh, Willie, what a question. Maud laughed and laughed. Of course not. Well, don't ever try one, said Willie. He looked sadly at his arm. Don't ever try one. Why, they kick worse than a bunking bronco.